After releasing Yakuza Kiwami and Yakuza 6 in the same year, Ryu Ga Gotoku Studio quickly got back to work just like always. But if you thought that announcing a remake of the original game, as well as an emotional send-off to the main character of the entire series together, and also releasing them in the same year was impressive, then what they would do next would be doubly so. Literally. On August 26, 2017, RGG Studio announced 4 new upcoming titles all at once, with the first of these being Yakuza Kiwami 2, a full remake of Yakuza 2 for the PlayStation 2. Similar to how the first Kiwami game remade Yakuza 1 using the same engine and core gameplay of the title that came before it, Kiwami 2 would remake Yakuza 2 using the Dragon engine and the core gameplay of Yakuza 6. And thankfully, excited fans would not have to wait very long for this one, because following the announcement at the very end of August, the game would release on December 12th of 2017, only a little over 3 months after that initial announcement. However, Kiwami 2 was also met with a good deal of skepticism, as fans of the PS2 Yakuza titles had already felt a bit disappointed with the release of Kiwami 1 just a year before it. So the question is, would Kiwami 2 manage to remake Yakuza 2 in a way that pleased longtime fans more, or would it be doomed to repeat those same mistakes? And most importantly of all, would it be a good Yakuza game? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 14th in a series of videos where I'm playing every single Yakuza game for the first time in release order and reviewing them as I go along. You don't have to have seen the other videos in order to enjoy this one, but I would definitely recommend that you've at least seen my videos on both the original Yakuza 2 as well as Yakuza 6, as understanding those two games is basically required to have proper context for talking about Yakuza Kiwami 2. So if you're interested in watching those first, or just seeing the whole rest of the series in general, I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, Yakuza Kiwami 2 is a full remake of Yakuza 2 for the PlayStation 2, developed by Ryu Ga Gotoku Studio, and published by Sega for the PlayStation 4 in 2017. As the game is a remake of Yakuza 2, it retells the story of the original nearly one-to-one just like the first Kiwami did. The game takes place roughly 1 year after the events of Yakuza 1, and sees Kiryu getting pulled back into a conflict between the Tojo clan and the Omi Alliance when the chairman that he appointed before leaving is unexpectedly killed. This forces Kiryu into finding a new chairman who will be capable of holding the Tojo clan together, while also keeping the Omi Alliance at bay in the midst of a coup being led by the legendary Dragon of Kansai, Ryuji Goda. There's a lot more to this story, and a lot that's definitely worth talking about, but outside of a couple of slight changes to dialogue in certain scenes, this is a perfectly faithful retelling of Yakuza 2's story. In fact, it's even more faithful and one-to-one than Kiwami 1's retelling of Yakuza 1. As such, I've actually already talked in depth on my thoughts on this story in my Yakuza 2 video. So in the interest of not repeating myself, we can just move right into the gameplay with this one. Starting with the presentation like usual, Kiwami 2 is a really good looking game, much like Yakuza 6 was. In fairness, this is because a lot of the assets in Kiwami 2 are just pulled straight over from Yakuza 6, especially in Kamurocho, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the game just looks really nice. The only major complaint that I have is that RGG once again pulled over all the cutscene animation data from the PS2 original, so you have these awesome looking character models that just move in really stiff and awkward ways a lot of the time during cutscenes. This was already jarring when they did it in Kiwami 1, but it's even more so here due to the higher fidelity models and assets of the Dragon engine. And it's even more noticeable when what little original animation data is in the game looks fucking fantastic. But then you'll go from that to scenes that feel like you might as well just be watching the PS2 version. It was still a huge treat to see some of my favorite scenes from Yakuza 2 redone with modern assets, as Yakuza 2 still has some of the most emotional scenes, and definitely some of the best cinematography from the entire franchise. But I just wish that they had reanimated these scenes while using the original for reference, rather than just straight up reusing the animation data from 2006. And the last thing on the presentation, the soundtrack here is significantly better than that of the first Kiwami titles. It sticks a lot closer to the sound of the original Yakuza 2, and even just pulls some tracks straight over without making any major changes to them, which is a great thing in my opinion. And while there are a lot of original Yakuza 2 songs here that have been remixed, these are honestly pretty 50-50 in terms of whether I feel like they're an upgrade or a downgrade from their original counterparts. Though I do still notice that pretty much across the board, these remixed tracks tend to have lost some of that grungier, more heavily distorted tone that remains so unique to the PS2 entries of the series. So overall, we have a really solid soundtrack here that doesn't actually feel like too big of a step back from the originals in my opinion. The loss of that heavier tone certainly still sucks, and a couple of my favorite tracks from the original Yakuza 2 are just straight up not here, but it doesn't feel like so much of a downgrade that I worry that those who only play Kiwami 2 will entirely miss out on the music of Yakuza 2. I mean here, just take a listen to a handful of tracks for comparison and see what you think. But of course, those of you who watch my videos somewhat regularly will probably know by now that I'm a bit of a stickler for details. So there is still something that I want to complain about when it comes to the soundtrack, but it's one that I can't actually play for you here in the video. That being the use of licensed music in Kiwami 2. See, the original Yakuza 2 had licensed a handful of songs from J-pop and jazz band The Crazy Ken Band for select scenes in the game that paired amazingly with the vibe of the new map Sotenbori, and also fit scenes like Kiryu fighting for his life after being stabbed on the riverside, or his kiss scene with Sayama at the end, pretty much perfectly, and gave those scenes a very distinct and memorable tone. Here in Kiwami 2 though, these songs have been replaced with a couple of songs from Japanese metalcore band Sim. And while these songs are great for things like Kiryu getting stabbed while contemplating if he's truly doing the right thing, they definitely don't feel as memorable as the smooth jazz that played during the original, and in all honesty, I have no idea why they used one of these songs for the kiss scene with Sayama at the end, as it feels incredibly out of place. But that's not even the worst of it, because what stood out to me the most was the songs that they chose for the credits. The original Yakuza 2 ends with a scene where Kiryu and Sayama sit next to a bomb that's about to detonate, and when the timer on that bomb reaches 0, everything suddenly goes silent and cuts to black at the moment that they apparently die. In the original Yakuza 2, this silence is then undercut by a rendition of the song Silent Night, which worked amazingly, as not only is it a Christmas song that reflects the fact that this game's finale takes place on Christmas, but it's also a very beautiful song with somewhat somber undertones given the context that it plays in. Here in Kiwami 2 though, we have that exact same scene, but we undercut the silence with another metalcore song from Sim. These changes lead to the scenes taking on entirely different tones than they were originally supposed to have, and while I think that the river scene in particular works pretty well, I have no idea what they were thinking with the kiss scene or the credits. And given that the reason these songs were replaced in the first place was because they would have to renew the license for the same songs from the original, I'm not sure why they wouldn't just spend the money to do that, instead of spending the money on something entirely different. It just doesn't make sense to me, and I had to complain about it somewhere here. Getting into the gameplay proper though, we of course have to start where we always do in these videos, the combat. Anyone who's played Yakuza 6 before Kiwami 2 will immediately realize that most of Kiryu's moveset in this game has been pulled right over from 6. So if you've seen my video on Yakuza 6, you already know how I generally feel about this Kiryu moveset. I think it feels good, but definitely not as good as most of the combat movesets that came before it in the series, and it never quite felt to me like I was playing as the Dragon of Dojima. However, Kiwami 2 simply uses the Yakuza 6 moveset as a base, while adding quite a bit of new stuff on top of it, and I actually think it works really well. They've added some new charge moves that are great, and instead of simply being finishers that you hold to charge up like the charge moves that we've seen from the series prior, these are an entirely new kind of charge move where you can actually charge them up at any time by simply holding the light or heavy attack buttons. And what's actually really cool about these is that you can still attack and do other things while charging. So you can do some really fun stuff, like charging up a big heavy attack while throwing out light attacks in the meantime, or vice versa. They've also added a lot of Kiryu's classic Komaki techniques back into the mix here, which makes him feel much more well-rounded than he did in Yakuza 6, since there's now a much nicer balance between offensive and defensive tools. Whereas Yakuza 6 was kind of just pure offense all the time, with really only one good defensive option in the form of the Tiger Drop. And even in terms of offense, some of Kiryu's missing techniques from Yakuza 6 have returned here. And while I never would have thought that any of these are as important as they are, it's amazing how awkward Yakuza 6's combat felt without them, and how much better Kiwami 2's combat feels now that they've been added back. Things as simple as heat actions against grounded enemies, and even just taunts, make things feel so much smoother and more complete here. Almost like I always have something that I want to be doing, rather than having these weird pauses in the middle. And now that I've felt how much of a massive difference these simple techniques really make, I'm kind of shocked that they didn't make their way into Yakuza 6. Something else that helps a ton is that the heat system has been changed quite a bit from Yakuza 6. Like I mentioned before, things like grounded heat actions and more have been added back to Kiryu's kit, leading to more variety and utility for heat actions in this game. But the biggest thing that improves this system so much is that almost every single heat action Kiryu has in this game is available at any time. And if you're not sure what I mean by that, I mean that they're not locked behind extreme heat anymore. In Yakuza 6, Kiryu had some heat actions when not using extreme heat, but if you wanted to use any of the actual good ones that dealt a significant amount of damage, you were forced to enter the extreme heat state and use those heat actions before the timer ran out. Here in Kiwami 2 though, this has been changed, and the extreme heat state now feels more like a temporary rampage state rather than just a barrier to using your actual good heat actions. I feel like this works so much better than the take on extreme heat that we saw in Yakuza 6, because now it feels like I can actually just use my heat actions like normal, and still activate extreme heat on the very rare occasion that I feel like I just need a much larger burst of power, which is so nice, and genuinely how I think this system should have felt from the very beginning. I do still have one major complaint with the heat system in Kiwami 2 though, that being that even though we've returned to a more traditional heat system and heat gauge, we're still missing one of the two key benefits of building up heat in the first place, the passive heat buffs. Things like filling up that base heat gauge and then entering an actual heat state with an aura where you could no longer be knocked down or stunned or whatever else was a big part of what made the heat system such a noteworthy mechanic in the first place, as it offered more depth to the system beyond just spending the heat that you've built up for large attacks. There was a level of strategy that came from deciding whether you wanted to use a heat action for a huge burst of damage, or if you wanted to just maintain those passive buffs in a more difficult encounter or boss fight, and Kiwami 2 is still missing this. Except, it's not entirely missing. I mean, these passive buffs have actually returned in Kiwami 2, but for whatever reason, they've been moved to the extreme heat state rather than just being a passive state like they used to be. And look, I get that the developers wanted extreme heat to feel meaningful, I really do, but I just feel like this was a huge miss. It removes the strategy from retaining heat entirely, as activating extreme heat will immediately start to burn all of the heat that you've built up until it's completely empty. So, rather than retaining heat for buffs, you're still draining all of your heat to only have them for a short time. It's just really odd to me that RGG would look back on Yakuza 6's combat and realize that this mechanic should return, but then bring it back in a way that almost entirely defeats the purpose of it being there. At the very least though, it did offer the extreme heat state some utility beyond just racing to spam out heat actions, and it did make it a lot more useful in boss fights, so I can at least give them that much. I just personally don't believe that they had to neuter the base heat system in order to make the extreme heat system feel more meaningful and worthwhile to engage with. And since I just brought up the topic of boss fights, they're way better in Kiwami 2 than they were in Yakuza 6, mainly due to some adjustments to the AI behavior. They don't have the crazy input reading and frame-perfect dodges and punishes anymore, which makes it feel a lot more like a fight where you can go back and forth with them, rather than one where you're just praying that your extreme heat actions will connect this time. The addition of more defensive options for Kiryu and the change back to a more traditional heat system also help a ton in just making it feel like you have more options at all times. And the changes to the extreme heat state, like I mentioned just a minute ago, make it feel more like a massive burst of strength rather than a necessity for dealing any decent damage. That being said though, Kiryu is really powerful in this game. So much so that when combined with the newly nerfed enemy AI, it can seriously trivialize some of the hardest fights from Yakuza 2. Using a similar example to the one I did in my video on Kiwami 1, a game with a similar boss fight problem, let's look at the fight against Ryu Ga Gotoku in Chapter 3. In the original Yakuza 2, this is the first truly challenging boss fight of the game, and the one that really establishes Ryuji as a threat to the player through gameplay, as they can actually feel how much of a rival he is to Kiryu. Here in Kiwami 2 though, you can just do this. And this is what you can do to some of the early game bosses with barely any combat upgrades. But as I'm sure you can imagine, this problem only gets worse and worse the later into the game you are if you actually engage with the side content, as a fully upgraded Kiryu in this game is an absolute monster. I could seriously pick out any of the late game bosses as examples of how these fights are just not balanced around the level of strength that players can achieve by this point in the game, but I'll just save all of us some extra time by telling you that I intentionally failed the QTE at the end of the final Ryuji fight multiple times so that I could fight him again. And the reason I did that was just because I was worried that I wouldn't have enough good footage of what's supposed to be the most difficult fight in the main story due to just how quickly and easily he was going down. So yeah, I'm not even exaggerating when I tell you that I fought this guy 4 times just to try to make sure I had a decent amount of footage for making this video. And as one final note on the bosses, I really wanted to mention that the Feel the Heat mechanic from the original Yakuza 2 has returned here, which was something that just made me smile when I first saw it. For those not familiar, Feel the Heat is a prompt that the player gets when the boss fight is just about over that allows them to mash a button on the controller to rapidly charge up their heat gauge for a big unique finisher. Here in Kiwami 2, this has been brought over nearly 1-to-1, which is both a positive and a negative for me. It's a positive because I'm glad to see that this gimmick that was unique to Yakuza 2 returned, rather than just being scrapped or replaced, as it really does feel like they kept it in here as part of an effort to retain a lot of the legacy from the original. But it's also a negative because it still feels really awkward just like it always did. It was always a bit jarring for the fight to suddenly be stopped by this mechanic kicking in, and even more awkward when the boss just kind of sits there while Kiryu charges up for a few seconds. The worst part though, is the fact that Kiwami 2 doesn't even have a unique finisher for every single boss like the original Yakuza 2 did, and instead mostly just reuses a couple of generic ones. There are still some unique finishers, with some of the most iconic from the original game, like the tiger drop on the tiger still being here, but the majority of the bosses just have the same finishers reused over and over again, which started to give me some flashbacks to Yakuza 3. So while I'm really glad that they decided to bring this mechanic back, just because it's such a unique piece of Yakuza 2, I think that it's worth noting that it has been downgraded slightly from the original, and I'm not really sure why RGG wouldn't just go to the effort to make a few more unique animations for it, since that was kind of what made this mechanic so noteworthy in the first place. So if you're gonna bring it back, you might as well put in the effort to bring it back right. Overall though, the combat in Kiwami 2 is actually a lot of fun, and a major improvement over Kiryu's combat in Yakuza 6. It still has some of the more fundamental issues of that game's combat, like the wonky physics engine and the glitchy throws and finishing holds, but Kiryu's more fleshed out and varied moveset is just so enjoyable that it made me completely forget about those things. I may have some mixed feelings on the boss fights in this game, but everything else is great, and I can confidently say that once I had all of the upgrades here, I definitely felt like I was back to playing as the Dragon of Dojima again. Moving on over to the open world stuff though, I feel it's only natural to cover the progression first, since we just covered the combat. And while I had a lot of positive things to say about the combat itself, I'll just rip the band-aid right off here and tell you that I am not going to be so generous to the progression of Kiwami 2. To start, Yakuza 6's experience system that uses the 5 different categories of XP returns here, but with some minor improvements that make it actually a lot better. Firstly, random encounters in this game now grant every single type of XP rather than only 3 out of the 5. Which helps to make them feel more meaningful throughout the entire game. They've also moved the heat gauge upgrades to being much smaller, more incremental upgrades on the stats page, rather than just having 3 large upgrades that are the most expensive upgrades in the entire game. This makes it so that your heat capabilities will actually gradually increase throughout your entire playthrough of the game, rather than suddenly doubling right at the very end. Which, in my opinion, feels way more natural and, weirdly, more exciting. And while we're on the topic, I feel that the stat increases in general are handled much better here thanks to the new tiering system they've introduced. At the start of the game, you can spend small amounts of XP to increase your stats, just like you could in Yakuza 6, but you'll only be able to go from 100 to 120 in any given category before you hit a cap. You'll then have to save up a considerably larger chunk of XP to unlock the next tier that raises your cap from 120 to 140, which encourages players to stop pumping their basic stats and explore some of the other cheaper skills in the meantime, and actually spreads out the most boring and grindy part of the progression from the prior game really well. So the entire XP system from Yakuza 6 actually feels a lot better here, since the stat upgrades are improved, way more of the upgrades actually give you new combat abilities or heat actions, and there are way less of those miscellaneous upgrades to eat up all of your hard-earned experience, and the ones that are still here just give you much larger increases than they did in the prior title, making them feel more worthwhile. The big new downside of this system here, though, is that the completion criteria in Kiwami 2 offer meager bonuses compared to what they did in Yakuza 6, which I'm assuming was likely a response to how people just broke the entire system by going out and eating at restaurants constantly. But this totally ruins the one thing that I really appreciated about this progression system to begin with. As flawed as I felt like this new XP system was in Yakuza 6, I really liked the fact that it was constructed in a way that pushed players into going out in the world and engaging with the side content to earn large chunks of experience that could then be spent on whatever upgrades they wanted. I'm a huge believer in rewarding players for engaging with side content in games, so that was the one thing that I thought was awesome about this system. Here in Kiwami 2 though, you get so little XP from doing just about anything other than the main story. I mean seriously, you do get all XP types from random encounters, but the most that you can gain from any one encounter without the upgrades that increase the XP gain is 10 XP per category. And don't even get me started on how little you earn from things like completing the sub-stories or the side stories, because get this. The bonus that you get from clearing the entire completion list for one of this game's side stories is less XP than you will get from a single mid-chapter combat encounter from about halfway through the game's main story. No, I am not exaggerating those numbers, they're right here on screen. So you get to choose. Do you spend 10 or so hours grinding out the side story, or do you just go play 5 more minutes of the main story for the same XP gain? On top of these issues, upgrades in Kiwami 2 are generally a lot more expensive than they were in Yakuza 6, which, again, I assume was done to offset how quickly people grinded out XP through meals in that game. But ironically, this, on top of the minuscule XP gain from the side content, eventually led to me just dropping the side content entirely and simply grinding out food at Sushi-Gin anytime I had the money to, as this could make the difference between spending nearly 100 hours doing every single piece of content in the game to get all of the upgrades, or just spending like 2 hours grinding out food. So overall, the XP system of Kiwami 2 had so many great improvements over Yakuza 6's, but a couple of fatal missteps that made acquiring all the combat upgrades feel even worse than it already did. Thankfully though, other forms of acquiring abilities through the open world, such as training with masters or watching DVDs, have returned here, which does help to make progression feel a bit better. It's always nice to be able to just go over to someone like Komaki, do a quick little exercise with him where you learn a new move, and then just have that move for the rest of the game after, which Kiwami 2 doesn't exactly do. See, you can go train with Komaki or watch a special DVD to gain a new ability, but you don't outright gain the ability, you instead unlock that skill and make it available for purchase with XP. This isn't the first time that they've taken this approach with training masters, but I've ranted about it pretty much every time they've done it. So for all of your sakes, I'll keep it short this time and just say that this still sucks, and I personally think that if players go out of their way to train and learn that ability through an in-game activity, then they shouldn't have to go even further after that and grind out experience to actually unlock it, especially considering how expensive some of them can get here in Kiwami 2. Similarly, Yakuza 2's ally system returns here. For those not familiar, this was a really small but fun system in Yakuza 2 where you could complete a sub-story for an NPC or simply just visit their shop enough times to befriend them, and once you had, they would help you out by throwing you a weapon if you got into a random encounter near them. This is still here and still pretty fun. But much like the training, once you've befriended one of these NPCs, you'll only unlock the ability to purchase the heat action for them, and still have to spend more XP on actually unlocking it. These are at least cheaper than things like the Komaki abilities, but still fairly expensive with a cost of 78 XP from all 5 categories. Regardless of the cost, it still sucks to get this reward and then have it not really feel like a reward since you have to put in even more effort to actually be able to use it. So overall, progression here is marginally better than Yakuza 6, but if anything exemplifies the sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back qualities of Kiwami 2, this would probably be the shining example of that. With that out of the way though, we can finally get into what's normally the most fun part of these videos, the open world and side content section. To start, I feel like it's only right to mention that the map problem from the first Kiwami game returns here. If you're not sure what I mean by that, I'm talking about the fact that in Kiwami 1, they simply reused the Yakuza 0 Kamurocho map while making some very minor adjustments to it, rather than actually remaking the Yakuza 1 Kamurocho for the game. This happens once again here in Kiwami 2, with them largely just reusing Yakuza 6's Kamurocho rather than remaking the one from Yakuza 2. This time feels even more jarring than in Kiwami 1 though, as Yakuza 6's Kamurocho was very much designed to feel distinctly modern and further showcase how the world is changing around Kiryu and moving on from the things that he's always known. So reusing that map for a game that's supposed to take place in the mid-2000s feels fairly out of place. And that's not even mentioning the fact that it then just goes back to resembling the older Kamurocho if you look to the next game in the timeline with Yakuza 3. The thing that actually annoyed me more than anything else though, were the new post-processing effects that they've implemented in Kamurocho here, such as the awful new depth of field effect that makes anything more than 20 feet away from Kiryu look incredibly blurry, and the one that everyone talks about, the green color grading filter. With the green filter, I get that they're at least trying to use it to make Kamurocho look a bit more like it did in Yakuza 2, but with the depth of field effect, I genuinely just felt like I needed to put my glasses on the whole time I was playing the game, only to find that I was already wearing them. Thankfully though, Sotenbori is back, and is still definitely my favorite district from the series. It was an absolute joy to get to explore it again in the new engine, and I'm really grateful that since they did have to make all the assets from scratch for the Dragon engine anyway, they did actually remake Yakuza 2's Sotenbori rather than just pulling over the layout from Yakuza 0 or something. It does still of course have one major issue though. I mean, at this point what in this game doesn't? That being that the additional smaller district of Shinseicho has been cut from the game entirely. You just straight up can't go there, no one in the game ever mentions it, and the small bit of main story content that took place in that district has now just been moved over to the main Sotenbori map. I have no idea why this was cut, although it most likely just comes down to time or budget issues, seeing as both this game and Kiwami 1 were pumped out in about a year on a shoestring budget, but it just sucks to see it be completely skipped over here, even though it is a fairly small part of the original game. In terms of what's in these maps, we do of course have a solid 75 sub-stories in this game that are all great. They aren't as intricate as they were in Yakuza 6, but there are considerably more sub-stories in this game than in 6, and since a lot of them are recreations of sub-stories from Yakuza 2, they're really just simpler because that's how the sub-stories were back in the PS2 games. They also aren't fully voice-acted anymore, but once again, the Kiwami games are made on considerably smaller budgets than the mainline titles are, so keeping the full voice acting even for the side content was probably out of the question. Regardless, I loved the sub-stories that I completed during my time with this game, with a lot of the original sub-stories being fantastic, and all of the remakes of the most memorable Yakuza 2 sub-stories being an absolute joy to revisit. There are also a lot of great minigames in this game, with pretty much all of Yakuza 6's minigames returning. Granted, there weren't a whole lot of minigames in Yakuza 6 due to the transition to the new engine, but the ones that were there were really good, and almost every single one has made its way over to Kiwami 2. There are also a couple of new hilarious minigames in the form of grab your photo shoots and toilets. Toilets is based off of a real series of gamified urinals Sega released in Japan, where you play little games on the LCD screen above the urinal by, well, peeing. And Grab Your Photo Shoots see Kiryu going to a photo studio and doing some spicy shoots with real Japanese grab your idols, with some appropriately hilarious dialogue options to boot. The only negative here is that the game is actually missing a couple of minigames from the original Yakuza 2, with things like bowling still not having made their way over to the new engine, despite the fact that the bowling alley is right there. But the minigames in this series are always a great time, and thankfully, Kiwami 2's are certainly no exception. Kiwami 2 also has a couple of solid side stories that are introduced about a third of the way into the game. The first of these is the Cabaret Club Grand Prix, the return of the Cabaret Club management from Yakuza 0. This side story sees Kiryu getting roped into managing a failing cabaret club in Sotenbori that just so happens to be owned by Yuki, Majima's star hostess from his cabaret club side story in Yakuza 0. And this works pretty much exactly how it did in 0. There are a few rival clubs in town that you'll have to slowly build up your own in order to take on in a one-on-one showdown where you see who can pull in more profits in one night. To build up the club, you can hire new hostesses, train the hostesses that you already have, select who will be in your lineup when you next open, and of course, just open and run the club in order to bring in more customers and spread the club's popularity through word of mouth. I really enjoyed this side story when I played Yakuza 0, so seeing it return here was a very pleasant surprise for me. The only thing I didn't love is that it doesn't feel like quite as natural of an inclusion as it did in 0, due to the fact that it still gives money as a reward for doing well and not XP. And even the bits of XP that you do get from the completion list criteria are barely worth the effort. All things considered though, it's fun to see it brought back, and if they're going to reuse content from prior games, you might as well reuse the best, right? The other side story here is the Clan Creator, returning from Yakuza 6 with some awesome improvements. This time around, the story for the Clan Creator sees Kiryu getting roped into Majima Construction as an advisor, shortly after finding out that they're having issues with a group of land sharks who are trying to steal the Kamurocho Hills project from them. This completely changes the main objective of the Clan Creator from being an all-out street brawl to being more like a tower defense game, with the main goal now being to defend Majima Construction materials and equipment from the thugs and gang members that these landsharks send to sabotage you. This, in my opinion, makes for a much more interesting objective, and the other changes that came along with it, like the new unit types, the better controls for the minigame itself, and some much more interesting progression and upgrades make for a massively improved experience over what was seen in Yakuza 6. That being said though, the rewards for engaging with the Clan Creator just aren't great, with this also giving tiny amounts of XP and mostly just paying out cash again for some reason, even though the Clan Creator was probably the best activity for farming XP in Yakuza 6 outside of just eating food at restaurants. So, with all that covered, I would say that Kiwami 2 has some really good side content on offer. It has great sub-stories, a solid selection of minigames, a couple of great side stories, and 2 full maps to explore. But the big issue here that hurts absolutely all of it is the lack of XP from the activities themselves, as well as the completion list bonuses, just making this content feel like a waste of time compared to either playing the main story or eating at restaurants. This would be a great offering of side content for something like a 100% playthrough, but for a more standard playthrough like the one that I did for this video, I found myself just dropping the side content entirely a few chapters into the game because I just didn't feel like I was being rewarded really at all for engaging with it. And while this is normally where my Yakuza videos would start to wrap up, we do still have one more major piece of content to cover here, as Kiwami 2 actually adds a full second story into the mix here in the form of the Majima saga. This is a full Majima side story that takes place between Yakuza 1 and 2, providing a glimpse into not only what Majima was up to during that time, but also the restructuring of the Tojo clan after the events of Yakuza 1. The main conflict comes from Terada trying to select a new captain for the clan, and a couple of the new guys who joined up after Kiryu left being the frontrunners has led to some tension among the patriarchs. This is where Majima comes in out of nowhere though, and sets himself up as the number 1 pick, which of course angers these newcomers. And later that very same day, Majima is framed for the murder of one of these other lead contenders. This forces Majima to investigate himself in an attempt to prove his innocence, which eventually leads him down to Sotenbori and ends up getting him involved in some stuff with the Omi Alliance as well. Everything else that happens in the middle of this story is pretty inconsequential, though I would be remiss not to mention the unexpected reunion with Makoto from Yakuza 0, with the two scenes in the story that feature her easily being the highlight of the entire Majima saga. The whole thing ultimately ends with Majima leaving the Tojo clan as an apology to the Omi Alliance for what he did during this story, which does feel a bit contradictory to the established reason for his leaving being his distrust for Terada since the release of the original Yakuza 2, but I guess the two reasons aren't exactly mutually exclusive, and both can be true at the same time. Personally though, I found this story to be really boring and predictable outside of the Makoto scenes, so if you're someone who was really hopeful for an awesome Majima side story, I would temper those expectations a bit. And unfortunately, Majima's combat in Kiwami 2 isn't much better, as it is so painfully limited that I genuinely just couldn't believe it. His moveset here is an incredibly stripped down version of his Mad Dog of Shimano style from Yakuza 0, and since I never ended up unlocking that style during my playthrough of 0, I have to say that this is not the best first impression, not that it's the fault of the style itself. In Kiwami 2, Majima has his rush combos with light attacks and heavy attacks, a spin attack, a double quick step, a block, and a tiger drop style counter attack. And that's it. That is his entire basic moveset, and I'm not even joking. That is every single thing he has. He also has a grand total of 2 heat actions, one where he just stabs a single target, and one that triggers when surrounded by multiple enemies that stabs 3 targets. And just to reiterate, these are his only heat actions. He has 2. So because of this small moveset, he feels awful in Kiwami 2 due to just how limited he is. Combat with Majima here feels super stiff and awkward, and I constantly found myself feeling like I just didn't have a good option for the situation I was in. So I genuinely did not enjoy a single fight during the entire Majima saga. Outside of the main story and the combat, there really isn't much to talk about here. There is technically some side content on offer, with Majima being able to fight in random encounters and play minigames, but he can't do anything that Kiryu can't already do in the base game. So side content is practically non-existent in the Majima saga. And if you couldn't already tell, I was looking forward to this part of the game quite a bit before getting to it, as I'm known to be a bit of a Majima fan, but when I finally sat down and played through it, I really didn't enjoy it much at all. It's a nice little 2-hour addition for those who might enjoy the story, but I personally found the story boring, the combat stiff and awkward, and the side content practically isn't even worth mentioning. So at the end of the day, I would say that the Majima saga is almost not even worth talking about when evaluating the overall package of Kiwami 2, which is incredibly unfortunate. Overall though, I think that for all of the flaws this game has, whether they be new or carried over from Yakuza 6, I still really enjoyed my time with Kiwami 2 way more than I expected I would. Ever since starting this series, I've heard all sorts of things about how people dislike this game, and have gotten a ton of comments like, oh, just wait until he gets to Kiwami 2. But I had a ton of fun playing this, and still felt like it was a really good Yakuza game. Without a doubt, a heavily flawed Yakuza game, but yet again, this has become a shining example that even the worst Yakuza games are still an absolute blast to play. That being said though, much like the first Kiwami game, I never really felt like I was playing Yakuza 2. I'm currently about halfway through replaying Yakuza 2 doing a 100% playthrough on stream, so that original game was very fresh in my mind the entire time I worked on this video, and it just never felt like a remake of that game outside of the cutscenes. It just feels like an entirely new Yakuza game that happens to retell the story of Yakuza 2. So once again, if you're a newer Yakuza fan who's played the Kiwami games but never the original PS2 entries, I would urge you to check those out sometime if you have the means to, as they really are a totally different experience from the Kiwami games, and in my opinion, they definitely feel much more coherent and just better as an overall experience than the Kiwami titles do, despite the older graphics and more dated mechanics. Now that I've played both Kiwami 1 and 2, I can fully conclude that the Kiwami games can be suitable replacements for the originals if all you care about is just getting the main story content, but both of them failed to truly replicate what those original experiences were. At the end of the day though, I'm scoring this just as a Yakuza game and not as a remake of Yakuza 2, so I'm going to give Yakuza Kiwami 2 an 8.4 out of 10. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Yakuza videos if you haven't already, or if you're looking to branch out a bit, maybe check out the series we did a while back where I played every Armored Core game for the first time. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our channel members and patrons who make series like this one possible. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and a comment to help me out with the algorithm, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Yakuza review.